Welcome to Interviews with Innocence, a podcast about spirituality, consciousness, and exploring the wisdom our children bring into this world. I believe that our very young children are our greatest teachers. After all, they're the masters of living in the present moment, bubbling in unconditional love, enjoying the messiness of life, and curious about the universe in all its dimensions. The pure essence that young children exhibit lives within all of us. My hope is that these interviews will help us discover, embrace, and connect with the sacred core of childhood that resides within each of our hearts. I am your host, Marla Hughes. Today, before the interview, I just wanted to share a few things. Dr. Rachel Harris, and we'll be talking about ayahuasca again today, as will Martina and Savita next week, and then that will be the end of my ayahuasca series. I just wanted to say that I am certainly not a proponent of talking people into or suggesting that they do ayahuasca. It is a very, very serious journey, but I find the healing that is possible for some is just amazing. However, there are many different ways in the healing process and the way people can heal. So with that said, here we go. Today, I am honored to have Rachel Harris on the show. Psychologist Rachel Harris is the author of Listening to Ayahuasca, New Hope for Depression, Addiction, PTSD, and Anxiety. She was in private practice for 35 years, working with people interested in psychospiritual development. During a decade working in research, Rachel received a National Institutes of Health New Investigators Award and published more than 40 scientific studies in peer-reviewed journals. She has also consulted to Fortune 500 companies and the United Nations. In 2005, Rachel traveled to a retreat center in Costa Rica and serendipitously found herself with the opportunity to drink ayahuasca with Ecuadorian shamans. The morning after her first ceremony, Rachel began asking questions about the therapeutic potential of this medicine. She conducted a 3-year research project with Lee Gurel that resulted in a study of ayahuasca use in North America, published in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs in the summer of 2012. Welcome to the program, Rachel.
Thank you so much.
It's so great to have you. And as you know, I've interviewed Dr. Tafur, Joe, a few times, and I know that you guys are good friends. And as we were talking about in our pre-conversation, I just love watching the two of you together. I just have to sit and smile the whole time because he has the medical part of it, and you're coming as a psychologist, and it's just kind of brings this magic together. So for my listeners, Dr. Joe Tafur is in this series, and so please go back and listen to his interviews if you have not yet. So Rachel, today I want to talk to you about your work with ayahuasca, and I want to talk about the mystery of this mystical brew today, because I just find it so fascinating. But before, even though Joe talked about it, could you just briefly explain to our listeners what ayahuasca is?
Well, it is a brew. It's a combination of two plants that's used in indigenous villages as a medicine. Indigenous villages in throughout South America, and it is used as an all-around medicine. I mean, it's the shaman is the doctor. It's the health clinic. So when people are sick or out of sorts or having problems or want to change their lives, so this covers medical, psychological, superstitious areas. It's really all kinds of healing. And wow. They will sit with a shaman. And you know what's really interesting to me is in some indigenous villages, only the shaman drinks. The people who come as patients don't always drink. And I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not sure which indigenous tribes that's true for, but it works
Right.
in that way as well. And so it's used in a lot of different ways. I mean, in indigenous communities, it's used to reveal where the animals are for hunting purposes. And it's used to,
Interesting.
identify if your partner is cheating on you, or to attract to someone that you've fallen in love with from afar. So it's, the indigenous use covers a lot of magic and other kinds of things. But my research and my focus has been on what are Westerners seeking from this medicine? How are North American people using it in North America? So the research study I did, the criteria was I was collecting data and interviewing North American people. And the only criteria was that they had been to one ayahuasca ceremony in North America. And that's how, this is a psychological study. It's not an anthropological one. And so the medicine, and I'm sure Joe talked about this in botanical, biochemical terms, is it does open up, the two plants together make the dimethyltryptamine available to enter the brain. And so that's the psychedelic. So people do have psychedelic experiences. They see lights, they see different images. Often they actually see visions from childhood. I mean, like watching a movie, literally. And even sometimes they see things that they didn't know about. They have access to information. Instead of knowing where the animals are to hunt, there was one woman who received information that who she knew as her mother was really her sister.
Wow.
So things like that.
Yeah.
So people get family secrets.
Right. Interesting. And how did you get involved in this?
Well, I also went to a retreat center in Costa Rica, but I went in complete ignorance. You actually knew what you were doing.
Well, sort of.
In about 2005, I was living in Princeton, New Jersey, and I wanted a tropical. It was February. I wanted to go to the beach. So a friend of mine had told me about this beautiful retreat center between the ocean and the jungle. And I thought that sounded great. And I know I looked at the program, but I didn't recognize the people. I didn't pay attention to it. I figured I'll just skip out and go to the beach.
Right.
So a day before I'm leaving for Costa Rica, I get a phone call, and the woman asks me, that she's setting up the logistics, and she says, well, should I sign you up for the ceremonies? And I brilliantly said, what ceremonies? I mean, I had no clue.
Right.
So as soon as she told me, I actually had a book by Ralph Metzner. So I had his book because I had bought it for the cover, never opened it. And it was one of his books. It was a collection of therapists talking about their ayahuasca experience. So
Wow.
I read that evening. And the next day I called this woman back who was doing the logistics, and I said, sign me up. So
Wow.
that's how I fell into it. So it came at a time when my daughter was finishing graduate school. I was no longer a householder. She was more, certainly far more independent. And really what I was doing was picking up my old life from the late 1960s when I was living at Esalen Institute in California. And drugs were a part of that lifestyle there. And so I was sort of reverting back to basics for me. And so I just fell into this. So was I called? I don't know. It was certainly very serendipitous, but it was not. It was not one of these very conscious callings. I mean, I've spent this last decade and a half interviewing people. So I've heard of a lot of stories of people saying, oh, I've had dreams of grandmother ayahuasca. She's calling me. I feel like the time is right. I had none of that. I just fell into it. And to
Yeah.
make it even funnier, the people I didn't recognize, Jeremy Narby was giving lectures that week. And
Wow.
I didn't even look him up.
Right,
I didn't
right.
recognize him. I didn't look him up. Yeah. So that's how I fell into it. And then I
Yeah.
had, and this is often true for people, that their first experience, their first ceremony is the most mind blowing. And it kind of bonds them in a way to the medicine. And so
Mhm.
that's what happened for me. It was such an amazing experience that the next morning I started asking all the Western psychological questions. How does this work? What does this mean? How is this, how did I get such a tailored experience perfect for what I needed? And
Right.
the South American shaman don't even understand these questions. They don't know how to respond to this Western
Mhm.
woman. These are crazy questions for them.
Yeah, that's kind of the beauty of it all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what started me searching, and then ultimately wanting to know, well, what happened to others? But the clinical question that I've asked all along, as any good therapist would, is, well, what happens after?
Exactly. I
How,
had read that in your research that a woman shaman just quietly said, "Why don't you ask the shamans, what kind of lifelong relationship they have with ayahuasca?" I love that. So what have you found?
well, that's what was so interesting. I asked, do you have an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca? And three-quarters of the respondents, and I had a good number in the group. There were 81 people completed a 16-page
Wow.
questionnaire. It took them hours. It was crazy. I had like 30 essay questions, and people answered them and then wrote me notes. People really wanted to talk about their experience.
Yes.
And three-quarters of the people had their own relationship with grandmother ayahuasca, who they could connect with in meditation, in dreams, just in daily life, just sort of focusing. They would sort of just tune into her. And I very egotistically thought, oh, she's only talking to me. I didn't question it. And she told me, go and do the research. And I thought, okay, I'll go do the research. I can do that. Turns out everyone's talking to her.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and
Well,
so she's this wonderful therapeutic presence in people's lives.
right. And when you say grandmother ayahuasca, why is that term used?
Well, that might be, there's a range of terms for this medicine and for the spirit of the plant. And so I think there's one village or one tribe that talks that it's grandfather ayahuasca. So
Mhm.
that's a very different image. And so grandmother ayahuasca may be what Westerners call her. I mean,
Right.
certainly in the indigenous cultures, she's a master teacher. That this is the spirit of the plant, and this is one of the master teachers. Tobacco is also, and that's generally considered to be masculine.
Yes.
So, it's an anthropological question. I don't really know how to answer, but certainly the Westerners refer to her this way and consider her generally a very caring, nurturing spirit, even when she's harsh and direct and confrontational. So one of my examples is this young 20-something guy said, "Oh yeah, I've heard from grandmother ayahuasca." And I said, "Well, what's the message?" And he said, "She told me to go home and clean up my room and get a haircut." And so that's why she's called grandmother. I mean, it's kind of
Yes.
direct, and then
Yes.
people have very different relationships with her. For many people, I mean, this one woman, a young woman who had suffered, had a difficult childhood growing up experience, and didn't have a very healthy a positive sense of herself. She suffered with low self-esteem. And grandmother, she just experienced such great love and acceptance from
Mhm.
grandmother ayahuasca that she began to heal that low self-esteem. So for her, it was like an attachment relationship, as this was the good mother she'd never had, and she actually began to feel better about herself, make different decisions in life, and it was a healing relationship. And
Right.
a whole different example was one young man was his message was, stop running around partying and using coke. It was kind of a practical, helpful bit of
Yes,
information.
yes.
And he felt so guilty because he didn't follow the advice. And he had a wild summer. And I talked to him, after that summer, and he said, well, of course she was right, but I didn't do it, and I felt so guilty. And I said to him, this was a leap, but I took it anyway. And I said to him, well, and did you go to Catholic school? Oh yeah, 12 years,
Of course you did.
I said, well, that guilt is part of your education.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And so that's
Very.
a very different relationship than with grandmother ayahuasca. So you get a sense of how, it is. And so my question is always, well, is this real? Is this ontologically real? Is this, are we really talking to a plant teacher, or is this a projection? And of course, there's no scientific concrete answer to that. So I suffer with that a little bit, but there is no question in my mind that this is, for most people, even given the guilt, it's a therapeutic relationship, and it's healing, and it can heal attachment disorders from childhood.
Right, right. I remember Dr. Tafur talking about the science, and obviously science has a very vital role in what we do and what we prove and Western civilization. But he said, people want to study it and then study again and do a blind study. He said, that's great, but it takes so long. And this stuff, kind of the proof is in the pudding, if you will, I mean, we see this over and over. Well, let's talk a little bit about the ceremony, because the importance, I know my experience, that's when I guess my relationship is even with the actual ceremony. I mean, I can close my eyes and hear the music and hear the shamans chanting or singing, and the smoke, and what they did when I was not feeling well, and just the beautiful support and energy of the whole ceremony. And it's a vital part. I mean, it's a must part of the actual ceremony. So can you speak on that a little bit?
Well, people always ask me, how do I know what's a legitimate, where to go, where to be
Mm-hmm.
safe, what's really authentic? And I've said things like, well, there are kind of two variables I look at. One is, have you been interviewed before you're accepted into the ceremony? Has someone really
Yes.
asked you serious questions about your health history and any medications you're on and that sort of thing? Because that's for your health. And not everybody does that. And if they don't do it, don't go. And then the
Right.
other one is, ask about the music. Does somebody sing?
Mm-hmm.
How is the music handled? Or is it a CD? What's the music situation? And I say, if it's a CD, don't go. You want someone with the capacity to sing. That's part of the healing. And
Right.
so if you don't have that, if you're just listening to a CD or a recorded, you're missing that active healing. And so that's a key element of the ceremony. Then, of course, I interviewed someone who went to a ceremony. He said, oh, yeah, it was a great ceremony. They played great music. And I said, well, tell me about well, they had this great CD of lots of songs.
Oh, no.
And then he told me how important the experience was to him. And I thought, well, this medicine works. That's just the bottom line. It works.
Right.
But my personal preference would be to check out those two variables about the medical intake, the health questions, and then what's the story with the music. And especially the
Right.
Shipibo tradition, the
Mm-hmm.
music is as important as the medicine. It is the
Right.
healing.
Yes, it was Shapibo where I went. Yeah, and I know that they would even say, and Joe said this, sometimes, we don't tell people they have to drink the medicine, just be there. And some people, when I was at the retreat, they also had holotropic breath work, and I had a really amazing experience, just doing the breath work.
And of course, that's a Western, it's a Western
Yes, true.
adaptation, which we've done to Vipassana meditation. Now in every strip mall, you can have yoga. And so we do it. Our culture blends with everything. So
Yeah,
this is
yeah,
happening also.
right. And you talk a little bit about how it's actually been shown how it can create new pathways, neural pathways. Maybe we're getting a little bit too much into the medicine now, but I know that Joe had talked about his experience with people who had he had gone through a ceremony with. And he said, you see them turn into like a child. The joy is like so childlike. And that really the only way you can have that sort of joy is through the heart and through your feelings. And I found that so profound because as he talked about, and I'm sure you agree, is that love and feelings are not something that we talk about a whole lot in Western medicine or in psychology. I guess you talk about feelings a lot, but I just found that really profound.
Yeah, it's very interesting how this medicine does things that. And well, let me just talk about the neurological for a minute, because that's
Sure. Yes.
incredibly fascinating. And then I'll talk about
Yes.
what we don't usually talk about. So
But we should.
this is a very big deal that all the psychedelics do this, including ayahuasca, is they quiet the default mode network.
Yes.
And that is our habitual way of um, supporting our sense of who we are. Our ego, the way our defense structures are organized. These are habitual neural pathways that feel like me. This is who I am. This is how I operate. This is my way of being in the world. And for most of us, well, for all of us really, they get established in the first couple of years of life.
Yes.
And that's mostly about survival. How do I survive this life, this family I'm born into, this situation, whatever it is? And so these are our defense mechanisms, all geared toward my own ego survival, just the way I am. I'm going to stay the same. This is it,
Right.
not changing.
And
And
sometimes you said also that as you get older, it almost turns into a prison.
I know. I've got this great cartoon, and it's not from a scientist. It's a cartoon, of like a Pfeiffer cartoon of a head, and then inside the head is like a jail cell the person inside his own jail cell. I mean,
Oh my gosh.
you know, we we create our defense structure to
Hmm.
ensure our survival, and then it limits us and does become something of a prison. And so the reason why people become sort of open and childlike and more carefree and joyous with after a ceremony is because this habitual way of being in the world is loosened. And that's literally that there are new pathways available, new connections made in the brain, new neural pathways I'm talking about, new connections made in the brain, and even neurogenesis, new nerve cells develop. So it's a chance to reprogram. And people talk about resetting, reprogramming.
Yes.
There are a lot of colloquial terms for this. And so people sort of understood that, oh, gee, this is giving me a chance to recreate myself, knowing what I know now, um, with uh, uh, with some great bigger perspective than a 2-year-old just automatically protecting himself. So it's a chance to open up more inner freedom and see things differently. And that seeing things differently cannot be underestimated. It's a shift in perspective that allows for greater possibilities, more creative solutions to our problems, to whatever it is we face in our inner world as well as the outer world. It opens up greater possibilities. And this is what therapy is all about.
Right. I know you talk about it. it doesn't take away, the things that have happened in your life, but what it does, it creates distance, distance from that traumatic event, distance from your personality and your ego. So you can, like you just said, look at things differently and be
It
happier.
sounds simple, but it is a major
Right,
therapeutic shift. And the way it sometimes happens with trauma, for instance, is
right.
some people will be able to watch a traumatic reenactment of something that they experienced as a child, but now they have the distance because they're watching it as if it's on a screen,
Right.
and they're watching themselves as a child. They're watching the perpetrator, whatever the perpetrators, they're watching the whole thing unfold, but with this distance. And so they're able to have often compassion for that little child themselves that they never had before. Sometimes even compassion for the perpetrator, understanding that the perpetrator may have been abused as a child. So it
Yeah.
opens up a much broader way of looking at things. And that in itself changes everything and allows for the traumatic memory to be metabolized in a different way in the person's history and held in their sense of their own life story in a different way.
Right. Yeah, when I went on my retreat, there was a gentleman there and he had been abused as a child and he had a fear and he didn't know it. And he had had a long history of drug abuse and just
Yeah.
was going off the rails, and he had discovered what was going on, and like you just said, he not only forgave himself, he forgave his father, and he saw that it had been in the lineage, and his
Right.
whole life just turned around. He stopped,
Right.
it just totally turned around. It was really beautiful. Something else that really touched me was, I think it was specific for this retreat center, but I think it could be just something that all people could think about when going through this. It was 3 steps. And the first step was, who have I become? And it's exactly what you're talking about, from that childlike, from the source. What happened to me? Who have I become? And they even suggested, which I thought was brilliant, to get a picture of yourself when you're like 2 or 3 years old and put it like on your screenshot and just have it there to check in with once in a while. I mean, I get teary-eyed just even thinking about that, but so that was the first part. And of course that's when a lot of the purging takes place, and getting rid of that. And then it's reemerge with your soul. So going back to the source. And the third one was heal your heart. And I just loved those 3 steps because they just made a lot of sense to me. And I know you've talked about how the shamans say it's a cleansing. They talk about it as being a cleansing of the heart.
Right, right, and a cleansing of the whole body, and
Yes,
and of
yes,
turning all the levels of the system, physical and energetic, to a greater balance. But
right.
there's this clearly is heart medicine, and there really is a transformation through the heart. And I don't mean the cardiac heart. I mean the
Yes,
heart center, the energetic center that is the heart. And I think ultimately this medicine is about love. And so
absolutely.
how does how uh, how is the heart center transformed to be able to be more open to feeling love, to being love, to expressing love? I mean, ultimately, what's more important? And so, a lot of the clearing has to do with clearing and polishing the heart.
Right, right.
And this is a core of many of the contemplative religious disciplines.
And interestingly, I've interviewed a lot of people who've had near-death experiences, and that's what they come back talking about, is it's all about love. And as it's so funny. Why is it so hard for Western civilization to wrap their arms around that and not think it's kind of hokey? That's so sad, because it's the most important thing of all.
Well, we have very strong roots in scientific materialism, and if you can't measure it, and pretty
Yes.
concrete.
Yes,
And
sweet.
so this is where it gets into some of the mystery. But the work on the heart is it's a part of the uh, mystical cores of many religions, from early Christianity, from the Desert Fathers, from
Right.
Kabbalah, from
Yes.
Eastern Orthodox, from Sufism. I mean, a lot of it is about purifying and opening the heart, and cleansing the heart. And so this gives us another avenue toward that process.
Right. Right. I loved it when you talked about that community, this community that is exploring, this kind of medicine. And you, at a Navajo healing ceremony, there was some research being done, and I think it was with Vision Quest. And this was the quote. For 4 days after the conclusion of the ceremony, the patient is considered by family and friends as if he or she is a holy person, and is given the opportunity to focus, evaluate, interpret, and experience a new self.
Isn't that wonderful to have that kind of community support
Oh,
rather than
so
doing a ceremony Friday night, being back in the office Monday morning? I can tell the best example I have is a terrific failure of mine. And this was,
I was actually going to ask you about your
yeah,
experience.
this was,
I love the way you
yeah,
begin this conversation.
this was a Harvard psychiatrist, long established practice. I mean, very prestigious and so forth. And he wanted an experience. And so I counseled him. And one of the things I said was, don't go back into the office Monday or Tuesday. Give yourself time. Well, he didn't. So there he is, Monday morning, 8 people lined up, 8 hours of work in his old, right back into the old straitjacket, basically. I mean,
Yeah,
his old way of being. And that was
right.
that. And I learned from the shaman, that some people are not called,
Yes.
whether through themselves or the medicine, but it doesn't work. Even when you think this is a perfect candidate, it's not gonna take.
Yeah. Well,
So
from your experience, does do people usually have one ceremony and they have this amazing therapeutic? I know everyone is so individual,
no,
so different,
yeah.
but when you did your research, had most of them only
No,
done
there
one?
is, I can absolutely say there's no pattern. It's a crapshoot. You never know
Yeah.
what you're gonna get. I remember, I write about in my book my worst ceremony, where I thought I was going to die, and I just sort of fell over onto a
Yes.
mattress and gave
Uh,
up. All right, I'm going to die. Who cares? Well, I had good friends there, and the next morning, their story was they sat there till about 2 or 3 in the morning. Nothing happened, and they drank at least 2 to 3 times what I drank. Nothing.
I experienced that too
And so
with
I
friends.
asked the shaman the next day, what? And he just said, well, they weren't called. And that covers a lot of questions. They weren't called. And it was true.
Wow.
Yeah,
A
I
lot.
mean,
Yeah,
I couldn't believe it.
yeah, we had two people in our group that, yeah, it's really
And
interesting.
and then, but I just want to contrast it with, you said somebody had said to you that, and I had referenced this earlier, that the participant doesn't even always have to drink, or even drink very much. It's
Right.
not a contest. Sometimes you see Westerners thinking the more the better, and that is not the case. So it's
Yeah.
not a contest. And I've seen people in ceremony who drink a teeny tiny little bit, and it opens up worlds of of wonder and different ways of being. So
Yeah.
it's not about, let's go for it and drink 3 cups.
No, it's not.
Let's see how much we can vomit. Um,
Yes, yes.
Purge. So it's about more subtle ways of relating to the medicine, which is
Right.
different than how Westerners often think more is better.
Mhm. Well, the interesting thing, and I know you talk about this also in your book, is that people, if they do come in with, their ego and, their large ego with them or whatever it may be, my gosh, does grandmother ayahuasca throw you on your, you
But we
become
all land.
so vulnerable and
We all land
so
hard.
broken open. Yeah, it's as therapeutic as it is, it's not a walk in the park for sure.
No.
Yeah. But isn't that the beauty of it? Who have I become? And you really have to, become, I feel, very vulnerable. I remember the first 2 days I was there, I just cried the whole time. And I'm like, what is happening to me?
We go, I know. We've all
Oh
got
my
this.
gosh. I'm never going to do this again.
Well, that's my mantra every time. Yeah. And I've there was one weekend I cried Friday night the whole night. Saturday night I drank again and I cried the whole night. I mean,
Yes, yes. Wow. So, can you tell us a little bit, unless it's confidential, about your work with interviewing the women shamans that are underground, that are
well,
doing the
this
work,
is,
and
this
what
is
have
a
you
new
found?
this is a new book, so I'm not going to say too much about it. But
Oh, okay.
I am interviewing the elders who have been working underground for a minimum of 20 years, most of
Oh,
them
wow.
far longer. These are I now realize they're shaman. For some reason, when I started this, I thought they were the original underground therapists, but they are not. They are not
Right.
therapists, they are shaman. So I dove I guess this is a pattern, like my trip to Costa Rica, not knowing what I was getting into. I thought I was getting into something different, and it turns out no, these women are not therapists. They might be therapeutic. Certainly the guided journeys are therapeutic, but they are shaman. And
Yes.
many of them have done apprenticeships and been trained, and there's quite a range in different stories. But their conceptual framework is that the medicine does the work,
Hmm.
and it's not about what
Follow up and
it's not at all the kinds of things that I look for. I mean, I was in private practice for at least 35 years, so it's not at all like any of that.
right. Well, I love when you say, I think this is so important when you and Joe were having a session together, and that you can't take a person who's had a mystical experience like this or an ayahuasca experience and then try to psychoanalyze it, because it's not really fair to try to, you can kind of, mess things up, if you will. I think you said those exact words. Can you
Well,
speak on that?
yeah, I can tell you about my progression. Is I think in the listening to ayahuasca book, I said something like, well, I'm always a proponent of therapy because I spent my life,
Absolutely.
as a therapist. Um, but I say, make sure you choose someone who knows this territory one way or another. And then, I had a chapter that I wrote this past year for a book on psychedelic psychotherapy, and it's a chapter on ayahuasca and psychotherapy. And I just flat out came out and said, only go to a therapist who has ayahuasca experience, who has their own,
Exactly.
because when that's true, and I can feel it now as I'm just talking with us, where we each have our own relationship to this medicine, that when we start talking about it in this way, there's a third presence.
Mm,
Something comes alive that's bigger than each of us individually. And that's what happens in therapy with a therapist who has their own relationship with this plant spirit. And
right.
so that's really what I recommend. how do you find someone like that? How many are there enough of those therapists around? Those are the problems. But
Right.
that's the ideal situation,
Mm.
and it's very it's here. So there are things that are inexplicable begin to happen. So I have a beloved dear friend who's a Jungian analyst, and he's been working with a shaman in Peru for I think 3 to 4 years, something like that. And so I've seen the stories. And he said, well, now I'm sitting in my office and someone comes in and I can see like a dark cloud around them. I'm beginning,
Wow.
and he's and he's straight in his office. It's just his sensory capacity has expanded as a result of the medicine. And so he's beginning to see energy configurations around someone, sort of like a psychic might report.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so it begins to change his way of practicing, of meeting that person, of understanding what needs to happen in that session. And so it does change the therapist.
Right. Right. Are you just, when you look back, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, would you be amazed listening to yourself saying all these things?
No,
And
you have to realize my roots came out of Esalen in the late 60s,
yeah, okay. Okay.
right?
Yeah. I
So
know Essalon well. Yes.
yeah, so I was not well suited for graduate school because I had already been I mean, I lived there for two years or so. So I worked
Yeah.
with some of the top people. I was 21, so I had this really strong foundation in all these unusual ways of working with people. So
Wow.
my strategy for getting through graduate school was to do a research track. And so
Yeah.
that's how I had the research background and expertise to do a research study.
Wow. It's almost like grandmother ayahuasca was just preparing you to meet her in a way,
Well,
you know? I mean, look, actually, I'm getting shivers. So I know that's true.
I know.
Look at your path. I
Looking
mean,
back, I would say the same thing.
yeah.
And when I started that original research study, grandmother ayahuasca said to me, involve Lee. And I said, like a spoiled teenager, I said, well, I've already talked to him. Sort of like, oh, I've
Right,
been there, done
right.
that. Don't tell
Yes.
me what to do. And she said, no, involve him. So I call up this nationally known researcher. He was my research mentor's mentor. So she died young. So I go to the next generation.
Right.
And he held many national positions of high caliber, and he's won national awards from the American Psychological Association. And I call him up and I say, Grandmother
This is Rachel.
Ayahuasca told me to involve you in the research. And there's this
I
pause,
love it.
and he says, okay.
Really?
And he was
Wow.
85 when that happened. He's now, much older. And
That is
we
a
just had a great
great,
time. We had a great.
that is a great story.
Well, it says a lot
That's
about who he is. I mean, he's very open.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Very, absolutely. Well, we need to wrap it up, but I did want you to speak briefly on some of the churches in the United States now that have ayahuasca ceremonies. And also, I know in Brazil, there are some churches that combine the ceremony with mediumship, which is, I find, not only fascinating, I just find it really cool. So can you just speak on that a little bit?
Well, it's the Santo Daime Church that also is
Yes.
some of their centers do involve mediumship, but well, they call they call ayahuasca daime, which is sort of the great give me. It's their sacrament. So it's not a
Right.
medicine; it's a sacrament. And
And that's how they're able to do it, right? In
well,
the
they're a
United
legitimate
States right
church.
now,
It's a
it's a religious, right.
Catholic church, and Umbanda, which has the spiritism part of it. And
Yes.
so, and Brazil is a nation of spiritists. I mean, and
Yes.
so it's for that culture, it's second nature. There's no big deal about it. Coming into this culture, it's a leap. for many people. And not every Santo Daime church includes mediumship, and some do, and not everybody's involved in it. And so it's can be part of it and not always.
Right. Well, I think it's a leap until it happens to you,
Oh,
right?
sound like you're reporting a personal experience.
Well, I am. I've had, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but what I mean is that I think a person doesn't believe in mediumship unless they have a profound experience
Right,
or a loved one has a profound experience.
right,
Then all of a sudden your whole
right,
world changes.
right.
Yeah.
It begins
Same
to
with
change.
the ayahuasca. Yeah.
Right.
Well, we need to, like I said, wrap this up, but would you like to just give any more amazing words of wisdom to the listeners?
I always want to include warnings, because this sounds like,
Yes.
oh, this is wonderful, and the truth is there are serious contraindications,
Right.
and I always want people to be safe. And so that's part of why I say, make sure someone interviews you about health history, and it's really not recommended if there's any history of psychotic break, schizophrenia,
Yes.
or excuse me, or even bipolar. Manic depression. So there's no point taking big risks, and that doesn't mean you have to be excluded. You can come into a ceremony and take maybe a drop, or sometimes the shaman will put a drop of the medicine on your forehead, and you can sit there and have a
Oh,
wonderful healing experience.
interesting. That's great to know.
You do not have to drink it. And so there is a safe way that you can do it. And frankly, there's no point taking risks with your mental health.
Right,
And then
right.
the other thing is, be very careful where you go, because I've seen even very experienced people go to someone and where it was the ceremony was not handled well. So you do want to be very careful where you put your life experience.
Yes,
So
yes.
I like to include those kinds of warnings.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Dr. Tafur also talked about that too. So it's hugely important. Well, thank you so much
Thank
for
you, Marla.
the interview today. I'm just honored, and I'm excited to have you come back and talk about your co-authoring the book Children Learn What They Live, which goes hand in hand, I think, with this interview that we just had. So you have a great day. Now, if people want to find you,
The website is the title of the book, listeningtoayahuasca.com. And
okay,
they can find me there, and they can contact me through that website.
great. And this, of course, will all be in the show notes. So thank you, Rachel, so much. And you have a great day.
Thank you, you too.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening in today. If you want to learn more about the show, you can find us at interviewswithinnocence.com and on Facebook or Instagram at Interviews with Innocence. Please write me a message, tell me what you liked, and let me know what else you would like to hear. I would love to hear from you. And if you liked what you heard, please leave us an iTunes rating and review. It helps other listeners find the show. Thank you.